presentations. If you haven't already checked those out, they're available through the Success by Six website, and very informative and interesting discussions. Today we have another interesting topic, and one which I'm sure is of interest to all of you on the webinar today. We're thinking about innovative practices and models when thinking about early years planning tables, and what those models are looking like in regard to things like systems thinking, the idea of trying to engage new leadership in the early years planning realm, exploring how these models can evolve and develop to really encourage that inclusion across different sectors of the early years. So I don't think I'll give too much more background, because we've got some great presenters that are going to be giving you both a bit of context of the I guess, over 2 decades of history of early years planning as it is developed here in BC. And they'll also be giving you a sense of how, on both a specific local level, whether it's in the Comox Valley or the Central Okanagan, how this has been developing and emerging practices around early years planning and early years tables development has been looking like over the last year or two. So I'm going to turn it over right now to our first presenters. In the Comox Valley, Joanne Schroeder, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with from her extensive work in early years community development, previously with MCFD, then significantly with the Human Early Learning Partnership, and now as the significant leader of the Comox Valley early years planning process. Along with Joanne, Lynn Joseph, who is the Success by Six and Children First early years community development coordinator in the Comox Valley, will be talking about the emerging approach that the Comox Valley has been developing for early years planning and collaboration. So over to you, Joanne and Lynn.
Hi, it's Joseph and Joanne. Hi, Joanne.
Hey, Lynn. I think Lynn's going to kick us off. Yeah, and I think we can probably go ahead to the first slide and get going.
Thank you. So working in the Comox Valley, we wanted you to understand where we are situated and the extent. So to the south of us, at the border is of Parksville, Qualicum. We have regional district rural areas, including Union Bay and Fanny Bay, both Hornby and Denman Island. And in the center of the valley are 3 municipalities: the village of Cumberland, the city of Courtenay, and the town of Comox. And then to the north of us, again within the regional district, is Merville and up to Black Creek. So that gives you a situation. We're in the traditional unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. We can do the next slide. So in our community, we had a chance to look at both the ways that we were gathering in the early years community and the impact and awareness that we were raising. And I came on as the new Success by Six coordinator almost at the same time as we were successfully awarded an early years center. And so the collaboration between Joanne and I and the coordinator of the Early Years Center really was the impetus for change. And it was very timely. So we looked at how we had continued within our initiatives and our various councils and collaboratives for the early years, and really wanted to engage more leadership and to look at both the municipal level, but also with the new provincial office of the early years, we realized that they would be part of our work as well, and that the effect could be at all levels as a result, which we hoped would create more sustainability. but we still wanted to hold the flexibility and the local decision making. Obviously, as you all know, the work that we do, whether we're direct service providers, managers or leaders or community workers, it really is important that unique decisions are made. Even within our area, there are rural engagement dialogues that we're having that are unique even to those specific areas, like let's say Hornby Island. So we built that flexibility and local decision making in. And the regional interactions, I think it's just really important that they're frequent and that that provides that impact that we're looking for. So a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, the way that it was structured in the Comox Valley was very much held together by the Success by Six coordinator. And there were a number of committees and or councils that had been established, and then it was as if committees of those committees had been developed and were sustaining. So that the efficiency, and it seemed as if the time taken for some people were sitting on up to 6 to 7 tables. And although that developed a strong network and relationships, the work that needed to be done hadn't impacted at the management and the leadership level as strongly as we would have liked. And so we decided that we needed to look at not only how we were organized and the role of the Success by Six coordinator now that there was an early years center, but we also needed to look at what we were talking about and how we could change. So 2 things needed to happen. We looked at reconfiguring this model and developing a strategic plan. So as you can see here, the councils were very specific, and you'll see how when we reconfigured, some stayed the same and others came into our larger collaborative and now the leadership table. So we had the early years interagency, which was primarily service providers. We had a family literacy outreach, which came on board when the literacy initiative came to the province. The school district still had an early learning committee. Obviously, the Aboriginal Early Development Council. We have a Father's Involvement Network and a Perinatal Advisory Council. So this is the way that we have reconfigured, and you can see that there are not only more partners at the table, but that there is representation, or this is intended to show that there's a stronger representation from those committees as well on the leadership and the larger collaborative. So the leadership table is representative of the school district and business, municipal leaders, MCFD, the Fathers Involvement Network, and that Early Years Interagency Council. It's also representatives are there from the Aboriginal Council, which includes parents, and from Island Health, which includes representatives from their Perinatal Council. We've brought recreation centers on board, and the groups that haven't come forward that we're still working with are the regional district, the faith community, and potentially interested citizens. And that would include parents or grandparents with little ones. So I think that it took easily 4 months to go to each of these existing councils and to talk to them about things like efficiency and new models, to have them buy in to this model. And this is what we have ended up with to date. So the larger, I'll explain in a minute how the larger collaborative works and the leadership table works. So the role of the larger collaborative really was intended to strengthen the developmental outcomes of children and to support their families in that. And that's a big piece of what we're doing, is working with families. So we intended to provide this overarching structure and to link those groups. So although some of us were going to many of those council meetings, not all of us were together as we are now to talk about the larger picture. And it also provides a place for us where some non-traditional partners can join. For instance, we have a real estate agent now. We've been able to involve the rec centers more broadly, and so that has been a success. Obviously, we are looking and have developed a strategic plan, which we'll be reviewing at the end of May, and that gives us specific goals, which we then did have to prioritize. Although it's not a large document and there's 4 goals, within that there's many outcomes and timelines. We have gained champions in extending the work out to everywhere from the publisher of the local newspaper into service clubs. And the collaborative also meets 3 to 4 times a year. And twice it's with the leadership table, because we do strategic planning, as I mentioned, in May. And in October, we get together to share information and resources. That was what we called a meet and learn this past year. And the other 2 meetings are for networking. They're around the funding recommendations, and they provide professional development opportunities. So the leadership team is the management team, and I'll explain the meaning of leaders in the next slide, but it's not just limited to the senior managers. There are historical leaders in our community who don't have that title, but that's the role that they play in our community. We obviously involve the public and nonprofit early years organizations, as you could see in that previous slide. And the membership is reviewed annually by the collaborative. So again, in May, we'll have a chance to look at potentially changes in, whether it's either changes in staffing or whether it's other members. They're tasked with implementing the strategic plan. They allocate the early years funding based on that strategic plan, and we have a chance to look at emerging priorities and opportunities. So the leadership team guides the work of Success by 6 in the Early Years Center, and that's important that we work that closely together, although we have distinct roles. The accountability of the leadership team is to the larger collaborative, and communication with those organizations about the work that we are doing. So I've developed different ways of the leadership table to filter the information through to the collaborative, and ways for the collaborative to filter information back to the leadership team. And that's work. I can't say that it's perfect right now. It's something that we're really working on. All the decisions at the leadership team are made by consensus, and we do meet monthly.
So Lynn, if I can just jump in, because for many on the webinar, they're trying to see how this this evolution of the early years planning model is developing, and I think for most community planning tables and coalitions, there's a sense of it starting from a grassroots, early years, frontline workers coming together, bringing their knowledge, experience, their engagement with families, working on strategic planning. And just so I can clarify for everyone who's part of the webinar today, it seems like one of the innovations that you're explaining at this point is that this leadership team is doing those activities, but there is a larger cross-sectoral collaborative, which is working, I guess, on a bit of a different level, and that's a bit of the innovation that that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what I feel from our perspective, is that many times a few of those managers and leaders were present in meetings, but it was rare. And so that the idea is bringing the conversation to all levels and yet having that interactive conversation as well. So that, as you say, the people who are on the ground, who see the gaps, who know the needs, have that communication, and it can be brought to a higher level where perhaps there are services, resources, or funding that we hadn't tapped into to either sustain a program or develop a new initiative.
Thanks for clarifying that, Lynn, and I'll remind everyone on the webinar that as these questions arise for you, or clarifications or comments, please let us know, and we'll try and build those into our conversation. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. And so when we talk about early years funds, again, we were often talking about the Success by Six strategic implementation funds and the Aboriginal engagement funds. But in our community, there was also a school district early learning table which had been maintained through the funding that was received from the Ministry of Education for early learning. And we have managed to keep in our community a percentage of that funding still. So the key to that is that that funding can now be considered as part of the larger community early years fund. The family literacy funding comes from our Comox Valley Lifelong Learning Association because they're able to be a part of Raise a Reader. We're lucky enough to have the press here with us, and they have been raising funding. That funding in the past has gone almost primarily to family literacy with birth to 6-year-olds. And the adult learning component of the Raise a Reader funding has been managed through the Adult Learning Center. So we see that as a portion of that Raise a Reader funding is allocated to the Early Years Fund, as well as United Way with Community Impact, and also now the Poverty to Possibility Fund has been providing support to some early years programs, and of course the Children's Health Foundation and the funding that the Early Years Center is provided through the Provincial Office of the Early Years. We obviously are looking for public funders. We actually have developed a marketing committee, and the work that they're doing is not only to raise awareness of the early years, but to potentially fundraise, which is something quite new for us as a collaborative. So our strategic plan was developed in September 2015, and this was a year's process, and I think that's so important, is to understand it wasn't an event. What did happen with us, as I mentioned, is all of the meeting with those earlier tables, the process of coming together as a group really was a process. And if we could go to the next slide, I'll show you how we started. So we decided as a collaborative that we would look at 4 questions, and these were developed out of brainstorming about what are the core values, what's our core vision, what do we want to find out about for action, for an action plan. And these questions were sent out to parents through the school district, but they were reworded relating to a parent. So number 1 is, what would the most important thing for your child be for their early development? And the school district was kind enough to use their system to be able to send these out to the parents. For the service providers, we were able to work with the stakeholders and get the information out, or bring them together so that we could talk about, both on charts on the wall, Post-its, cafe-style conversations. So we wanted to know about the importance, we wanted to know about making programs accessible, we wanted people to think about their role, now that's the stakeholders, and then also the parent, and then what supports do they wish existed. We can go to the next, thank you. So in doing so, we had, as I say, gathered people together in many formats in the community to ask the questions. And when we received the responses, even from children in our Strong Start centers and a couple of childcare centers, we had that broad range of the big thinkers and down to people who, the parents and the children who were looking to the services and programs to be provided. And we analyzed those really pieces of paper and charts all over the floor and looked at what those core themes were. And when I say we, really Joanne and I and the coordinator of the Early Years Center at the time facilitated this. And we had a session of finding our heart to really look at what our values and our principles were, and so that we were able to state the vision, the purpose, and the values. Then we held a World Cafe, and we looked at how the themes had emerged, and did those relate to goals, and how could we articulate them as goals and priority actions. So we have 4 goals. Each goal has objectives, and within those objectives there's priority actions. So that was done, and then there's always work behind the scenes, putting that information back together again, and then we called together a working group of the collaborative to write the plan. So we had strips of paper with the statements on them, and we actually literally moved them around on the wall to see how they fit under those goals, and it was incredible how it just came together because we'd identified the themes. We took that then to the leadership table, and we were able to present to them and have a dialogue that they would approve the draft, and that draft was then presented to the collaborative. Then the work begins.
So Lynn, if I can just jump in, we've had a few questions coming forward. Certainly we'll let everyone know that all of these slides and the interesting diagrams explaining this process will be available and sent out after the webinar. But would it also be possible for us to share the Comox Valley strategic plan with those who are participating in the webinar?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've given it to Nicole, but I certainly will do that again for it to be shared out, however that's most useful.
Thanks very much. It's these important models that allow us to build on our collective experience. Thanks.
Thank you. And this is where Joanne steps in.
Great. Thanks, Lynn. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Joseph and Nicole for organizing these sessions. So I'm just going to first say a little bit about how the Early Years Center, the EYC, has been working along with the Early Years Community Developer and the Collaborative and Leadership Table in the Comox Valley. It's very interesting to me to see how this new but relatively small, you may or may not know that the Early Years Centers receive about $52,000 a year, has really been a catalyst to support and nurture the work we've been doing to try to enhance our collaborative practice and our way of working together in our community. So I think that that's an important kind of factor to think about. Not that not that every place is an early years center, of course, but I think having that link to a provincial network, and maybe it's through Success by Six or another, CAPC or one of the other provincial networks that people might be involved in, but that is kind of a catalyst to say, yes, you're on the right track, and the integration and collaboration should be moving forward. You can go to the next one, Nicole. So I think in the last, and I better just touch base, Joseph, in terms of how much time I have, so I can pace myself.
We've got lots of time, Joanne, so you've got a good 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk about the idea of thinking about the early years community development planning model as a system, and how we've been trying to build a culture of system thinking in the Comox Valley. So before I get into this slide around being a systems thinker, I think I'll probably just stop for a minute and define what I mean by system. Because system, I think, is becoming one of those words that's used very broadly by people to mean a whole bunch of things. We have the healthcare system. We talk about kids who grow up in the child welfare system. We talk about systems of support for families and kids. And all of those things are systems. But when I'm talking about it in this context, our system is really about community early years planning, collaboration, and integrated service delivery. And my little visual for that is to think of the Comox Valley as kind of, and I always talk about it as a picture I have from a Margaret Atwood novel that I have read after the apocalypse, which is probably not a very good metaphor to use, but of a place with a geodesic dome over it where everything within is interconnected and thriving on each other. And that's how I try to visualize the Comox Valley and the work that we're doing around early years planning. And that's the system that I'm talking about with respect to this. So I think we can go on to the next one now. Thanks, Nicole. Before you can really start to build strategies to change a system, I think you have to do work together around being a systems thinker. It's really about a little bit of a culture shift and the kinds of ways of being if you want to effectively think about systems. So I'll just go through some of these on this slide. Certainly the most important is this idea of being able to see the whole, see the connections between the organizations, between the initiatives, between the levels of governance, and think of how those things are interrelated and how they interact with each other, rather than thinking about single organizations or events coming together. Certainly always looking for the connections between the people and the organizations around the table in the planning model, assuming that, nothing stands in isolation. And not only are we impacted by each other's organizations, but certainly by events that happen in our communities, by particular issues or socio-demographics in our specific communities. So always trying to think about how those things are interrelated. I think my computer might have just died, but let me just see if I can get it back on, and we'll be happy. Just talk amongst yourselves. I got it. Oh, sorry. Somehow me and webinars are never quite in sync. The next one is to think about changing perspective. And I actually think about this one as about trying to have more empathy for people around the table. So when we recently did an exercise at our leadership table of trying to allocate some common funding from our newly evolving Community Early Years Fund, we talked about not just taking off our hats, which is something that we've often talked about around community planning tables, but actually taking someone else's hat and putting it on and really trying to look at the world from the perspective of a Ministry of Children and Family Development staff person or a public health nurse or an assistant superintendent of schools, and really trying to see what their perspective might be and what would be the barriers and challenges that they would bring to this collaborative planning process. The fourth one is something I'm not always that good at, and that is being prepared to be wrong. It's kind of freeing in some ways, though, because I think for many of us who really believe in the collaborative process and want to facilitate things, we take a lot of responsibility on ourselves to try to make it work. And I think that idea of, hey, I don't have the ability, nor should I even be trying to fix this by myself, can be really quite freeing. So the strongest thing that you can do to be a systems thinker is actually just to listen and to discard your own assumptions and to hear about what other people's perspectives are. Really try to stay one step ahead and anticipate what might be the consequences if we decide as a group to fund this approach, what's going to be the cause and effect, and what's going to happen next. Really embrace the ambiguity or the chaos. This is a very complex process in terms of doing community early years planning, and I think we forget that there isn't kind of a sequential way of doing things. There isn't a real concrete way at times, and so to be comfortable with that level of chaos. And I think in the Comox Valley we've had to do a lot of that of late, because every meeting it feels like we go to and we say, okay, let's try this time. We're just going to try it out and let's just see how it works. And so it really is asking people to be open to some ambiguity and find the leverage. You know, and that's where to go back to the whole idea around the leadership model, that it's so important to have people around the table who have different kinds of levers to be pulled. So maybe it is someone who is well connected in the business community. Maybe it is the community services manager from MCFD, but trying to identify a whole breadth of levers across the system that you can use, and know that even sometimes a small change can have a large impact on the whole system. I think we can go to the next one. Just showing the picture of our system. It doesn't have the geodesic dome in it, but I'm working on that. Anyways, I think the most important thing here, and again, it's never quite this simple, but I think it's been a helpful way for us to look at it in terms of clarifying and defining the role of the Early Years Center and what I think of as civic engagement and the work that Success by Six is leading in many communities, and how those things are interconnected. So the way we've done that is really thinking about a lot of the work that the Early Years Center is doing is on integrated services, really trying to find new and innovative models, looking for reduction of barriers, engaging new organizations through our satellite network. The work that Success by Six is doing is certainly around increasing awareness, public education, really engaging those non-traditional champions, the parental engagement, and really linking up all of the initiatives in our community, whether that be family literacy or the early childhood educators. But both of those pieces are contained within our One Community Early Years strategic plan that Lynn talked about, and they couldn't be separated. That would be very difficult in my mind for the Early Years Center to work in isolation from the broader work of the collaborative and the leadership table. So you can see in our system that that leadership structure and that strategic planning process oversees both parts of that system. And I know that that's a question that I've had quite often is, how does Success by Six and the Early Years Center coordinator work together? And I think in our community, we've had some success in trying to figure that out. Carry on. So I'm going to talk now just about what I see as the key drivers of impact, or the key criteria for success in terms of this new model. And when I say key drivers of success, it is in no way to say that I think we're anywhere close to success, or even that I know exactly what that is. But I do know that these things are making a difference, and we need to focus on them. Underlying all of the drivers of impact or keys to success is time. And I don't think that I can overemphasize the importance of that enough in terms of the effectiveness of any early years planning model. So certainly in the early days of putting this new model together, Lynn and the staff of the Early Years Center and myself and other people around the table met a lot. You know, we got together a couple of hours here, 3 hours here. There was no sort of shortcutting having that kind of involvement. And although as we've kind of found our feet around it a bit more, some of that may have lessened, but not entirely. It's, you know, this is a commitment of time, certainly for Lynn in her role as Success by Six coordinator, but importantly also for me as the executive director of the host of the Early Years Center, a key partner in the leadership table. There has to be a commitment on my part, and certainly on others around the table, that this isn't just a once a month meeting, but that we're able to connect in between time and do some shared planning of how we're going to get together and plan. So that's, if there's one thing that hopefully you'll take from today's webinar, that would be the one, is that it takes time, and there isn't a particular way to shortcut that. I think, okay, oh, I said all that. You can go on to the next one. Relationships. And again, the strength of relationships of people around the table, and I know I'm not telling any of you on the call anything that you don't know already, but it absolutely is foundational to having impact within the planning model. And so looking at the level of trust and respect, how much competitiveness there is around the table. And that's one we've been looking at quite a bit, and as we try to morph our funding model, is how can we put structures in place to reduce that level of competitiveness between organizations. Need to have fun, and so that's always great. The length of people's relationships is going to make a difference. How functional they are, because we all know that sometimes there are relationships that have been around for a long time, but they actually can be quite dysfunctional and quite toxic to the kinds of working together that we're hopeful to be doing. And then acknowledging some of the things around hierarchy and power that will be playing in to those relationships.
Joanne, could you speak to how in your development and in the relationship building in this work, you've broached, or your collective has broached the idea that within the early years, there's a lot of, I guess, variety in the sectors of the early years. There's a disparity in funding. People have different levels of, I guess, professional background and education, and the positions are funded in different ways. Is there ways that you've talked about that and come to some sort of, I guess, a common understanding?
Well, I mean, it's certainly an important consideration, and not a totally easy nut to crack, but I think the only way that we have made any progress in terms of those kinds of differences, whether it's in your level of pay or the stability of your job, or in the kinds of power that you have in the relationships, there's a lot of difference. And the only way we've been able to tackle that is to go back to that whole idea of changing perspectives and having empathy across the members of the table. So as part of our strategic planning process, certainly we all developed through our Finding Our Heart session, what were the important values and principles to us, what was our common vision. And we use that as a touchstone moving forward. And, we talk about that when we sit around the table here, we are all just people representing the children and families of the Comox Valley. There's nobody that is more important than anybody else. We have different levers. If we are a member of ECE, the Early Childhood Educators of BC, we might have a different lever than somebody who's within the school district. But we don't wear those hats. And although, it would be naive to suggest that that does away with those differences altogether, I think really building that sense of being people committed to children and families of the Comox Valley, first and foremost. We try not to introduce ourselves as executive director or anything like that. We don't, the whole concept that we come to the table representing something, I think has actually historically been quite divisive to early years planning, because when you represent, you feel you have to have a particular perspective and a particular rigid voice that in fact is completely contradictory to systems building. So it's a great question, Joseph, and a tough one, but that's sort of the strategy that we've had, and that's hopefully starting to get some traction with, that we're all in this together and we all have something to offer to the kids and families of the Comox Valley.
Thanks for getting to the heart of that for us.
Okay, leadership. So Lynn touched on this a little bit, and I think it's a really important point, and certainly I think one of the hiccups that we've had in the development of this model is that we have historical and natural leaders, and typically the historical and natural leaders in early childhood have not been senior administrative people in any of the social service organizations. They've been frontline folks, typically less well paid, less well respected, etc. And to go into a community and say, okay, great, you guys have been doing an okay job for 20 years, but we think it's more important to have the bosses around the table, is going to piss some people off, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so it's been really one of our key challenges to acknowledge and raise up the importance of that frontline leadership. Again, it just is bringing a different richness to our table, and to make sure that people still feel included, even if they're maybe not now sitting around what we're calling the leadership table, but to continue to find a way to value their voice and leadership, and that's been tough, and we've had to be really open to hearing about some of the dislike from some of our members around that. But it's critical to have organizational decision makers at the table, and you have to balance that they won't commit to being at the table if there is a lot of time spent at the table in networking or conversation about day-to-day early years practice. So how do we make room for both of those things? So the leadership, it doesn't really say this here, but it has to be collective, so it has to be shared, not just by the coordinator or the chair of the table, but really by the whole table, so that everyone around the table thinks of themselves as a leader. if you want a good book in respect to that, there is one that's called Everybody's a Leader, that I can send the link to Nicole, and it's a really easy read and lots of good ideas in it. Shared vision, I think we've talked probably quite a bit about that, but it is also a key driver of success to help people feel like they know where they're going and how we're going to get there. And, you know, the reality for lots of people who work in early childhood is it can be kind of discouraging at times. And so to, I think, open up for people that there's an opportunity for change and being part of something different is one of the key ways that you get engagement in collaborative planning. And you keep going back to that as a pillar and a touchstone as things get complicated and messy and competitive and all of the things that they continue to get at times. You have that to go back to, saying, remember, this is what we're here to work on. And to make it achievable. Sometimes I know it sounds like the language that I and others use is about changing the world, and I don't intend that. I'm very aware that what we need to do is just make some small steps. You know, a different program time, or breaking down a barrier for some of our rural families, something that's really quite achievable. We do need to have integrated structure and processes, and this is the thing that can often stop us in our tracks, is when we start to think about common intake processes, common mechanism for allocating funding, those kinds of strategies. And I really recommend to people that the pieces around building relationships, building common visions, building your shared theory of change, they come first before the structure and processes. Because if you start with figuring out how we're going to do a common intake or how we're going to share funding before you have those foundational pieces, it's very you can very quickly lose your way. I think we're done at those again. So here you go. That's the end of my bit with a little bit of a quote. That's one of my most favorite quotes in the world, is that trying to do things a little bit differently, a little bit innovatively, and learning as you go.
Thanks so much, Joanne and Lynn. I think we've all been able to follow the very ambitious progress and innovation happening in the Comox Valley, how the shift has been both philosophical and a systems-driven mindset that's resulted in an evolving model. Once again, just a reminder that as these questions and thoughts and reflections on what you're hearing this morning are coming, please send in your questions. We've had a few so far, and we'll continue to bring those up through the conversation and in our time remaining at the end of the webinar. But for now, let's shift our attention to a similarly evolving process, one that's newly developing in the Central Okanagan. And we'll ask Amanda Turner, the Success by Six Community Development Coordinator in that region, to talk about how things in a similar but very unique fashion are starting to evolve in terms of the early years planning tables and process and model in her region. Amanda?
Hello, everyone. Here I am in the Central Okanagan. So happy to be joining you today. I'll admit that this is my first webinar, so I'm a little bit nervous, but really excited. So thanks so much to Lynn and Joanne. Their process is not new to us here, but inevitably, whenever you go through some of a process and then hear something again, it's like, oh right, there's always new bits and pieces. So, and I love that you left us with that quote, Joanne, because I really do feel like we don't have a path that we're following, but we are certainly carving our own. So yeah, I will get started telling you a little bit about our area, kind of similar to how Lynn started her process today. So I'm in the Central Okanagan, which many of you refer to as Kelowna, but we are a little bit beyond just the city of Kelowna. So we're in the traditional Silks territory of the Okanagan people, and we run along the Okanagan Lake in the southern interior of British Columbia. And when I was looking at some British Columbia maps yesterday and realizing that our region is quite, I think, small in geography compared to a lot of the other regions in across the province. And our area is made up of a self-governing First Nation, which is the West Bank First Nation, as well as we are very fortunate to have only a single regional district within our boundary, as well as a single school district, which I know many others have. It's complicated when there's different lines through your region, so we're really fortunate in that way. We also have 4 municipal governments in the area, which is why we're not just Kelowna. So we have the District of Lake Country in the north, the City of Kelowna, the District of West Kelowna, all the way across the bridge that you guys maybe are aware of, and the District of Peachland in the south, which is our southernmost piece before we fly down into the South Okanagan. So in our area, while we are small in stature, we are grand in people. So we have about, the last stats that we have was about 190,000 people in our very small little spot here. And at that time, over 12,000 children aged 0 to 6 that we're hoping to serve and make better of their lives. And our area, as of a few years ago, was deemed one of the fastest growing populations in Canada. And our school district has been one of the ones within our province that has been increasing in population as well, which proves a different challenge than other communities I know where population in the schools are decreasing. So a little bit different here than in other places, I think. So I'll tell you a little bit of the history of our early years in the Central Okanagan. We've been host to a Children's First regional initiative, which is called CATCH, or Community Action Towards Children's Health, since 1999. And then the Success by 6 regional initiative began in the Central Okanagan in 2003. And these tables came together to start to work to create an Aboriginal early years table in 2006. Recognizing that the priorities that were coming about in kind of the larger part of our community were not representing the needs of that unique Aboriginal community in our region. So that kind of spurred that creation. So over the past decade, our local Success by 6 table, CATCH, as well as Aboriginal CATCH, have developed really strong communities, really strong connections in our communities, as well as really strong relationships with our partners. Joanne underlined how key it is to have strong relationships with our partners, as well as the 3 tables have had really strong relationships amongst the 3 tables. So throughout the last decade, some of the activities and actions and projects and priorities that Success by 6 CATCH and Aboriginal CATCH have done include training opportunities, networking events, parent education events, developing and distributing early learning resources, funding programs, services, and supports. So probably pretty similar to some of the work that others on the call are doing as well. And so all 3 tables have been collaborating on a lot of the projects and activities, and mostly partly in order to leverage funds and maximize resources. So we know that we only have between the 3 tables, we only have so much of a pot of money to work with. We only have so much time for the coordinators to work on these activities. So it makes sense to pool some of those resources So the relationship between the tables, oh, I'm not quite there actually. There we go. The relationships between the tables include funding relationships. So funds move between those three bubbles on your screen. And in regards to membership among the tables as well. So we have some members who are who contribute and are partners at all three tables. So that means contributing at 3 separate meetings. It means contributing to additional activities and events and supports that each of those are doing. But some members are just partners at one of those, within one of those bubbles. So a lot of the times that leaves some people with only part of the story or knowing only part of the work that's taking place in the early years. And I have found that it leaves people well, wanting to do more if they don't know that it is taking place in other parts of our community, or it leaves them feeling like there are gaps. When if we had an opportunity to have the full story, you'll see, oh, that's taking place in this area, or these are the individuals who are focusing on that piece. So yeah, so that has been kind of our history in a nutshell. Maybe I'll just mention too, so as Joseph said, I am the Success by 6 coordinator, so I am within that light blue bubble. Within the dark blue bubble, Aboriginal Catch has a coordinator that some of you probably have heard on our coordinator calls or have met in past, and that's Catherine Disbury. And then in the dark green bubble, we have a coordinator, Myrna Kalmakoff, and I think she's on our call today as well. So she might have some insights from her perspective as well. And so Myrna, and then Catch also has an admin assistant person who is Eve Lehman. So those are our individuals who are coordinating at each of those, coordinating each of the bubbles. Okay, so now I'll move into a bit of our process that we have been toiling maybe through. So at different times in the past, certainly community members and as well as table members have indicated that they have been confused about the differences between the tables and the roles, particularly between Catch and Success by 6 in our community. And it's not really entirely hard to understand why, since both of these initiatives work from a community development approach, both focus on the early years, and both have many of the same partners guiding and supporting the work. And indeed, we know that many of the communities around the province combine these two funding pots and create one entity for their community. That's just not taken place in ours. So last year, Success by 6 made it part of their strategic plan to facilitate dialogues between the tables, basically in order to just explore the concept of moving toward a more formal partnership. So during the last summer, when the Office of the Early Years requested the community responses to the Help Us Plan to Plan document, that was a bit of an impetus for us, where all three of the tables really critically looked at the structure and the function of our early years tables and the model that we were using. And at that point, the tables came to a bit of an understanding of the need, I think, to consciously focus some energy on developing an early years planning model that fits with the direction both of the Office of the Early Years, but also that best meets the needs of our community, and I think fully utilizes the resources that we do have. So after that point, the coordinators came together to do some research looking at different community models. And one that we spent some time exploring that you guys would be able to find is from the area of Waterloo. And we began to develop a concept that would lead a conversation among our partners. So that was kind of summer and fall. And then this past winter, as the tables were heading into our strategic planning season, we invited Joanne Schroeder actually to come and present on the Comox Community Early Years model. And this was in order to kind of, I guess, provide an idea of what's possible to our table members, as well, just to enlighten that there's other ways of doing our early years business, I guess. And so that was really helpful in just providing, a new vision and a new perspective on, there's different, we're never stuck doing it a certain way, that we can always change and shift and move to be more effective and be more responsive to what we have in our community.
So Amanda, could I ask you from you're talking about how the progress and the development of this dialogue. In terms of the community stakeholders, the people who are participating in those planning tables, would it be safe to say that they've been striving for the most meaningful and effective way for them to be participating? Because it seems like there was a lot of solid structure in place, but to what can you attribute this real desire to shake things up, to find what perhaps is a more effective model? Where is that coming from?
I would say, different community members, obviously, particularly since they come from different sectors in our community, certainly will probably have different perspectives. So I can think of a couple. So one motivation I think would be around efficiencies. So if we have an executive director who is spending an hour and a half to 3 hours at 3 different meetings a month, for them, they were looking for an efficient way of being able to communicate their perspective in a meaningful way in the process, and some efficiencies in not having to repeat themselves, I think. So that certainly would have been one of the motivations. And I think the other, some of the other motivations is, finding the right fit for their contribution. So over the last, we have had credit union contribution and support and membership at the table since forever, which has been fantastic. I think over the last few years, trying to figure out what is, how is their expertise best utilized within the early years is something that is probably part of their impetus and motivation to finding where can we best contribute to what's happening in the early years, knowing what we know and coming from the sector we come from. Let's see here. What would be some?
I think that's very helpful. Thanks.
Okay. I think probably the efficiency one, and then I'm going to get to the other one, which is around some clarity and some focus and some clarity and focus. I think would be the other ones, but I'm going to hit that right now. So, that's perfect. That leads me right into the next piece. So, as we delved into our initial strategic planning, particularly this year, there was just some really clear confusion, if that makes sense, around who was responsible for what activities in the past year. So we often do a little, what went well, what did we accomplish in the past year, what went well, yada, yada. And I realized that we had these 3 tables, and I called them apple, orange, and banana. And it was really the coordinators and the partners that were really deeply involved that would point out that, this activity was apple, and this one was orange, and that was banana. And meanwhile, many in the community, and indeed many of our partners, seem to be lumping it all together and saying, we know that's early years. We know there's different pieces doing different things, but really to us, it's all the same. And what I realized was, to them, we weren't really 3 separate pieces of fruit. We were just fruit salad. And the community was much less attached to who was doing what than just the fact that there was some coordination and some focus on the needs of children and families in our community. So that was kind of it was a bit of a realization, and I felt like a really good metaphor for kind of where we're going. So I presented this to the group after I kind of had this kind of aha moment. And one of our table members said, "That's great. I totally understand. Like you got me. I figured this out. But let's be clear that we're not becoming a smoothie, that we're not going to the point of mixing it all together, because there are some unique pieces, particularly around our Aboriginal engagement, that are not just, it's not just all one and the same, that we would be able to pick out pieces that are still unique." So that was kind of another point. So at this same point that this realization was happening, there was basically a complete overlap of strategic goals for the Catch and Success by Six tables. So the idea was brought forward to have a single strategic plan that would be shared. Now, up to this point, all three of the bubbles, all three of our tables, have developed and worked off of their own strategic plan. And however, like I said, so much of the work was happening together. So this felt like this combined, or this shared strategic plan felt more like a formality around planning and about having some structure, rather than a really truly large change in our community. So while we had different strategic plans, many of them said similar things or had similar activities or places where we were coming together to work on the same activity. So this shared strategic plan seems like a bit of a logical next step. But I must make clear at this point that our Aboriginal Catch has a specific mandate for looking at Aboriginal children and families, and have their own strategic plan that reflects the work of their partners around the table in contributing to the Aboriginal children and families' lives. So we're working together on this, so that the shared strategic plan honors the Aboriginal Catch strategic plan and refers to their work, but it also goes forward to outline areas where the broader early years community can clearly support the goals and actions that are outlined by Aboriginal Catch, where that might be helpful and appropriate for the larger or the broader early years table to support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's all coming through clear.
Okay.
And I think we're all appreciating the analogies that you're bringing to what is otherwise sometimes an abstract conversation.
Okay, good. I'm much more, I'm much more visual and literate than sometimes comes through. So where we are right now is where Joanne said, like, embrace the chaos. And we have warned those around our table that basically we've said it's going to be messy. It's not going to feel finished. It's not going to feel like you're going to leave and be like, oh, okay, now I know where we're going. Maybe not so much. It's a little bit of a trial and error kind of point right now. So we have brought together a working group that is made up of members from all three of the tables. And the role of this working group is to develop a memorandum of understanding that will outline kind of how this partnership looks and how it works together, and a terms of reference. Will basically be to ensure that this partnership has a solid platform for growth and for where we can go with it. So the working group has at this point developed, so this has been since March, so this is really fresh and new for people who think that, oh, you've got it together. No, not really. We're just mucking through. So the working group has developed a letter of intent, which basically outlines the process that we'll be going through in developing this partnership. So this letter of intent will be brought to the broad early years table at the end of May. And the idea is that this letter will be signed by all the partners, basically formalizing this goal of working towards a partnership. The working groups also has begun the work of creating basically our shared vision and our shared understanding of what we're wanting to do, our long-term outcomes, how we work, our shared values, and our understanding of the strategies and the roles that the early years partnerships play in the community. We're not service delivery, we're community development, and keeping that basically front and center. So this has not been a reinvention of our wheel, but I think it has been more of a re-engagement of the core foundational beliefs around the work of community development in the early years, because both Catch and Success by Six have had, visions and values and those kinds of things, but sometimes when you don't bring those back to people to review or to say, does this still feel right? Or, these are our values. Are we working in this way? That those bigger, like above the tree kind of pieces can be lost when you're working on an activity or doing an event, right? So those that shared vision, outcomes, values, strategies kind of piece has come together to create what we have thus far drafted as our model of change. So similar to our Success by Six provincial theory of change, we have a bit of our own local model of, if we work in this way, if we take these strategies forward, if we share these values, then this is the vision, this is the outcomes that we'll have at the end of the day. So that has been a good process, I think. So all that work has been taking place within, and has been brought back to the working group to say, yeah, this looks like what we want to be able to move forward with. And that's all going to the early years table in May, at the end of May. And then I guess kind of combined with that, we've drafted our shared strategic plan. So this will be again brought forward to the early years table. And I had written down some of our objectives that that this shared strategic plan has. I'm happy to, again, like as Lynn said, to share. It is at this point it is a draft, so keeping that in mind. But our objectives that the early years table is working towards are number one, improving children's development, particularly the social and emotional domains. Number two, increasing awareness of child poverty and its effects. Number three, improving the access and capacity of integrated early years services, supports, and programs. Number four, developing and strengthening a sustainable model for the early years. And number five, developing and supporting child and family-friendly practices and policies. So when I looked at Joanne's kind of pieces around, the one bubble was the early years center and integrated services, and one bubble was child civic engagement. Ours is a little bit more fluid, I think, although we do have some defined, like 5 kind of objectives. It's not like the Catch is taking on 1 and 2 and Success by Six is taking on 4 and 5. It's a little bit more messy, more mushed together, I guess. I will mention around our, I guess I'll maybe contrast the early years center work that Joanne and Lynn talked about. So our early years center has been a work in progress for the last 2 years. We just found out this spring that we would be receiving funds for our early years center, along with we've applied and have received funds from the United Way for additional services to be housed within what we're calling our Central Okanagan hub. So that has been going on basically under the leadership and support, I guess, of Catch, along with, again, as many of the other earlier center processes have gone with a variety of other partners, of course, as well. We also have been developing over the last year a process, and we were successful in securing an Aboriginal Early Years Center, which will be coming together on the other side of the bridge over with West Bank First Nation. So those processes have been not a key part of this model process, but basically knowing that those are taking place, that we're involved in those earlier center, that we're involved in those earlier centers, but not, I don't think it was kind of a driving force like maybe it was in the Comox Valley. So that's a little bit different for us. So our end goal that we're looking forward is creating, I guess, a new system, like Joanne spoke to, where things work together for the betterment of children. So we're hoping that at the end of this, whenever the end might be, that our Early Years Partnership is effectively organized and aligns the early years work within the Central Okanagan, and that would include decision-making, accountability, structure, processes, and people. That it has a clear role for stakeholders and empowers them in those roles by utilizing their strengths, their interests, and their passions. That our partnership emphasizes working across sectors and collectively with policymakers, decision makers, service providers, our Aboriginal community funders, business community, parents, and families, and inevitably works together to make a positive difference in the lives of young children and their families. That is the end goal. So yeah, that is how we have basically gone through, I guess maybe quite quickly in our community, basically over the last almost year. It has been an ongoing before that, particularly around just some of the confusion about, and some of the, I think, willingness to get together to create something new. Although we haven't maybe had the leadership or the push to be able to say, okay, well then what's stopping us from moving forward on this?
Great, thanks for that, Amanda, and thanks for giving us a lot of that very specific detail to some of these issues that have arisen through this process. What were some of the motivations that were coming along, and really where you're at in this rather uncertain present, but with a clear sense of what are the objectives and hopes of the stakeholders involved. So that brings to us to the end of our presentations, and we still have a little bit of time left for questions. If you've got some on your mind, please send them in now. If you'd like to offer some comments about your own model of early years planning that's existing or that you're aiming towards in your community development work, please feel free to share that with us as well. While we're waiting for some of those questions, I'll start with a few that are already emerging, and we'll start with a question for Lynn. We heard from Amanda about the engagement of the Aboriginal planning table in the process. And I guess the question there is recognizing how important and significant the pillar for Success by Six, the Success by Six provincial initiative is on supporting meaningful Aboriginal engagement in the early years. How is the community planning model in the Comox Valley recognizing Aboriginal identified early years priorities and bringing an Aboriginal culturally appropriate protocols into that decision-making process?
Well, I think one of the documents, Planning for the Seasons, was used initially to look at a potential format which was brought to the table, and there are many voices, both those historical leaders and the role leaders who sat at all of those tables. as we were both reconfiguring and as we were gathering information to lead towards the strategic plan. The Aboriginal Council meets quarterly as a distinct council, and they allocate the Aboriginal engagement funding separately from the leadership table, so they asked that that be determined, and that was part of their terms of reference for many years, so that is being respected. And also, I think the idea that we have broadened the Aboriginal Council table as well, so reaching out to some of the non-traditional stakeholders. For instance, the Women's Transition Society had hired an Aboriginal outreach worker who, of course, was working with women with young children, and she now sits at our table. One of the things about the Comox Valley, just briefly, is it's a very urban Aboriginal community. If we look at the school district, of the over 1,100 students registered as Aboriginal, 25 at any given time, kindergarten to grade 12, are from the Comox First Nation on reserve. So when we have conversations, a lot of our families are integrated into programs within the community, as well as Head Start, Aboriginal Early Years, Friendship Center programs.
Thanks very much, Lynn. We'll move on to another question, this one towards for Amanda. And the question is, in recognizing all the change that you're talking about from the established planning table models, how have you and your early years community development colleagues, Myrna and Catherine, been supporting that change management with the partners, with the stakeholders sitting around those planning tables? Have you brought in facilitation? Has there been a need to really think about talking about change management and learning about it?
Good question. So Myrna, Catherine, and I are working really closely together, I think, as we go through this process. And in terms of bringing, I guess I kind of think about it as kind of bringing people along on the journey, making sure that people are feeling like they are being communicated with, that people aren't feeling like, whoa, what the heck just happened? Like we were having these meetings, we were going along, and all of a sudden now what happened? So keeping really clear lines of communication, and then I think kind of bringing people back to like, so remember last summer when we were going through that help us plan the plan process? Remember this past winter when we brought Joanne, so we did bring Joanne in to talk about how they, you know, what their new model looks like in their process. Remember how we made this, you know, that we have this working group so that people feel like that we're not like running off with it, and that people are being included in the process. I feel like I kind of left saying people, I think, have been waiting for this to happen, but there hasn't been leadership in saying, okay, well then let's move forward on it. So, and I feel like the coordinators have been providing that leadership in saying, well, if we don't move our model forward, then we could potentially be left behind, or we could potentially be at a disadvantage, or we could not be doing as great a work as we can be doing. So I think our coordinators have been doing a lot of the leading of it and trying to ensure that people are, well communicated with, and that they feel like they are feeling like it's that they're part of the process, that they're not being left out, that they know what's happening. Does that answer?
Great, thanks for that those thoughtful insights, Amanda. It seems that we've come to the end of our time for today's webinar. I'm sure there's a lot more questions that that you have on your mind, and all three of our presenters have offered to be able to follow up with your specific questions. I think you can certainly appreciate that there's a tremendous level of experience and expertise in this changing and evolving process of early years planning tables and models for planning. Significantly, Joanne Schroeder, who comes at this work with a very thorough and experience and expertise in early years community development, has offered to provide answers to your questions and perhaps support to leaders in your own community who may be curious about what her role has been, not as a coordinator in this process, but rather as the executive director, as we heard, of a child development association and the contract holder for an early years center in that community. As well, Lynn and Amanda, whose work in community development coordination, as we all well heard, has been thoughtful and introspective around supporting this process of innovation and development. So with that, before I turn it over to Nicole for final notes and follow-up, I'll just thank once again our three presenters, Lynn Joseph, Joanne Schroeder, and Amanda Turner, for their offering of really interesting information and a real sense of where community planning and early years community development can continue to grow and evolve for all of our communities across the province. So thank you to our presenters. I'll once again mention that we do have another webinar coming up, webinar number 5, the last in our series, focusing on early years screening networks, health fairs, and outreach around the idea of early years health and reaching out to the broader population around screening. That webinar is on June 15th from 10 to 11:30, and you will certainly receive notifications to register for that webinar. So I'll turn it over to Nicole to let you know about our follow-up from today's session.
Thanks everyone for attending. So as in the past, we will be uploading this webinar to YouTube and also following up with an email which will include the presentation slides, contact information for all of our presenters, so you can reach out directly if you wish. The link to view the webinar recording, as well as a few resources that were mentioned throughout the presentation. So we'll have a couple of strategic plans for you and anything else we can find that is relevant to this topic to include for you. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to the provincial office here and we can get back to you. As well, feel free to contact the presenters directly with your questions. Thanks again for attending and have a great day.